for Jesus is saying, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, promises were made to them. Actually, what he's saying there in the Old Testament is, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the idea is, if you read the Old Testament, that's frequently the foundation for God's blessing. I'm going to bring good on you, Israel, because I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And you read through Deuteronomy in particular, and he's going to say, according as I swore as I swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, to Jacob. In other words, I'm going to fulfill this promise to them. And so I'm not sure that I'm going to necessarily say that a covenant is generational. I think, and a promise is not. I think they're probably both generational because, again, the resurrection, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are still alive somewhere, and God's got to fulfill the promises that he made to them. Yeah?
So with the covenant, if there's a few, do you
Uh-huh.
want us to focus on one covenant, or do you want us to be really broad and talk about all of them?
I would be broad. You don't necessarily have to go through all the details. This is intended to be kind of a survey. In fact, the instructions say that you investigate the theme in the Pentateuch, investigate the theme in the Old Testament, investigate the theme in the New Testament, and then summarize the message of the Bible. And each of those paragraphs should be 100 to 200 words. So it's summarizing. It's not going in depth. I'm imagining that this would probably be a front and back sheet of paper is probably what you did. I give an example in there so that you get an idea of what I'm looking for. And I go through the theme of the law. And there's instructions in here, but I'll just read what I have for the section on the law in the Pentateuch. It says, although the word itself doesn't appear, the theme of law begins in Genesis 2, when God tells Adam not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This command is given in the context of creation and blessing, and Adam and Eve's disobedience bring a curse. This sets the pattern for Scripture. Obedience to law brings blessing, while disobedience forfeits blessing and instead introduces a curse. When God brings Israel out of Egypt is the true official introduction of the law. At Sinai, God communicated directly with Israel and through an intermediary to give his law. Okay, so both directly, that's the Ten Commandments, and intermediary, that's through Moses. These were considered a gift, God's instruction for how to live successfully before him. Sadly, Israel immediately rebels against God's law. The problem of the rebellion of God's people is a foreshadowing of what is to come in the Old Testament. Throughout Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, many laws were given to the people of Israel. In Deuteronomy, Moses sums up the laws and pleads with the people to obey God and receive a blessing. He warns that disobedience will bring death and curses, whereas obedience will bring life and blessing. Okay, so that was like 190 some words I checked. I was like, if I'm going to tell them 100 to 200, I got to hold myself to that as well. But that's kind of what I'm looking for. For me, that was 3 paragraphs, just a brief summary of all the books of the Old Testament, the law. And then you can look at the project and I go through the rest of the Old Testament and then the New Testament. And then that summary is really designed to take all of those and just kind of condense it so that you can see, here's this idea in Scripture and here's how it goes from the beginning to the end. Any questions on any of that? Yes, Jay.
Are the themes that you described, you want us to pick one of those, or can we set up our own? And
yeah, I gave 5 as an example. If you want to do your own, I'm fine with that. Yeah, I think for most people that'd be helpful. But yeah, if you have something that you look at that you really want to do, go for it.
Okay.
All right, good question. Okay, let's see, where did we leave off? We were working our way through the law. That's right, that's where we left off. And we were in a section about thinking carefully about the Old Testament law. All right, and so as we go through this section, we had used the illustration of a family's house rules. Okay, so when we think about the law, I think it's helpful to think of them as like the family house rules. Why? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, these laws are not simply arbitrary. House rules are normally designed so that the house can run smoothly. Similarly, God's laws are not simply arbitrary. They're designed so that his creatures can live a good life. They're designed with the best interest of everybody in mind. And just as in a home, if you've got somebody that's just blowing all the rules, they're making life miserable for everybody else, but ultimately they're going to make life miserable for them. Not only that, when you break a house rule, it's a relational thing. It's not just kind of this legal thing, right? Sometimes we think about God's laws in the Old Testament, and a lot of them are just civil laws. This is how you're supposed to live. If you kill, if your goat kills their goat, here's what you're supposed to do. We're kind of looking at this, and it feels very legal, and it is legal. But at the same time, again, going back to what the book has been saying, this is Israel views himself as living in the presence or before God himself. God is dwelling in the tabernacle. Later, he's going to be dwelling in the temple, and this is God's land. And so this is God's family. If you're a part of Israel, you're part of God's family. And so if you go and kill somebody, you've done that. You've violated a personal command from a personal God who's living there. And so just as in a home, if I give my kids instructions and they disobey those instructions, number one, it's going to mess up the flow of the home. But number two, that's a personal offense against me, because I, as their parent, gave them an instruction and they didn't obey it. Finally, these house rules are designed to teach about life. And this is another element of the law that we see. Curfews and bedtimes teach the importance of responsibility and self-discipline, as do chore lists. Rules for treating siblings well will translate into other later social relationships. Such rules keep the home moving along, but they also provide wisdom for life. As a parent, one of the things that you're trying to do is you're trying to teach your kid how to be an adult, how to live successfully in the world. And so we don't let them scream at each other because, well, number one, it's unpleasant. But number two, I don't want them to go to their job and start screaming at people, because they're not going to have a job very long if they do that. And they're certainly not going to move forward in their job if they do that. So the laws that I give, the instructions that I give to my children are designed to teach them the right way to live. Similarly, God's laws, it's more than just, hey, don't do this or you'll mess everything up. It's, hey, this is the way I, as your creator, have designed you to live. And that's why the psalmist can say, I love your law. I meditate on it day and night. Like, really? You meditate on what to do if your goat kills another goat? Well, he's meditating on the law because the law is teaching about life, and it's instructing Israel about how to live in the presence of God. Okay, let's move on to the next point there. It says, why are the laws so repetitive? Now, there are 4 major law codes in the Pentateuch, and I don't think I cited this, but I found a helpful article from the Dictionary of the Pentateuch on the law, and they broke it down like this, and I thought it was good. First of all, we have the 10 Commandments. This is Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. We also have the tabernacle laws. That's what we're going to be talking about here in just a minute, Exodus 25 through 40. And these are all, hey, here's how you build the tabernacle. Here's what goes in it. I think there's even some instructions about here's how the priests are what they're supposed to wear, those sort of things. We have the laws of Leviticus and the laws of Deuteronomy. Okay, Leviticus obviously is a book just chock full of laws. There's 2 stories in there, and basically in both of them somebody dies, and the point is take God's law seriously. Okay, and then Deuteronomy 12 through 26 is a repeat of many of the laws that we find in Exodus 20, Exodus 25 through 40. I borrowed their thing, and I thought, oh, that makes sense. They actually missed one because we have the Book of the Covenant in Exodus 21, end of 20, but mainly 21 through 23. So that's probably another one that should have been in there. But Deuteronomy is going to take the Book of the Covenant, it's going to take the Levitical laws, and it's going to kind of combine and mesh and interpret them for the next generation that's going into the land. And so that raises questions. Why is Deuteronomy repeating laws that have already been stated, and why are they not repeated verbatim? That's another thing that confuses people. Like, did God stutter? Did he change his mind? Have these been altered? This is partly because ancient people thought of laws differently than we do. Since laws were designed to teach wisdom for life, we often find them reapplied and exegeted for the next generation of Israelites, and we see this in the book of Deuteronomy. And remember, their setting is about to change. That's a big part of this. So they're living in the desert, and they're wandering nomads. They're about to enter into the land of Canaan, and they're going to be settled agrarians. Okay? They're going from a nomadic life to an agrarian life. They're going from we all live in tents and we just all pick up and we move to we're all living in homes and we have neighbors that are the same neighbors that we've had our whole life. So life's about to look very different. And so what Moses is doing is he's taking the laws that were given to them in the wilderness and he's showing them what those laws are going to look like lived out in the land. There's a question of how we can apply the Old Testament law. The law was given to Israel. The law given to Israel was divine wisdom and guidance, but it was for a specific people living in a specific time with a very specific worldview. In fact, during the colonial period, you may remember that there were people who came over, the Puritans in particular, and said, well, we get to start our own country from scratch. You don't get to do that very often. So they came over and they said, we're starting our own country. What are our laws going to be? They said, well, God's already given it to us. We're just going to follow the Old Testament law. How awesome is that, right? And it didn't work so well. Why not? Well, because they weren't Israelites living under a theonomy. So the law isn't, especially the Old Testament law, you can't just copy and paste it. But at the same time, we don't want to just throw it away. So instead, we look into the law and we see God's wisdom applied to specific issues in Israel. And that can help us realize how God thinks about life. Paul gives a really good example of this actually in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. He gives a principle where God said, don't muzzle an ox when it's treading grain. You're like, great, I don't have an ox, doesn't apply to me, we can keep reading. And he says, wait a second, there's a concern in there. Do you think God's really concerned about ox? You're like, well, I thought so. And I think his point is, he says, no, the law there is teaching a broader principle. And the broader principle is this. People who work should be rewarded for their work. Right? It's only fitting. That ox has been treading corn. Don't put something on his mouth so he can't eat as he's walking around and treading this corn. Let him snack a little. And so he then takes this principle, Paul does, and say, based on that, pastors ought to be paid for their work, and gospel workers ought to be paid for their labors. Like, how do you get that? From ox. And his point is, those who labor have a right to be compensated for their work. Even ox. If God cares about ox and making sure that the ox is compensated for his labors, it's from a lesser to the greater argument. How much more those who are serving in the gospel? Now, in that context, Paul's going to go on to say, but I haven't taken any money from you, and even though I have the right, and because of that, you ought to be willing to give up your right, or at least your supposed right, of going to eat food that was sacrificed to idols and idol temples. And we can get off on a tangent there, but we won't, because we got to keep moving. So we see God's wisdom. We see it applied to very specific situations, and what's helpful to do is to work backwards and to say, okay, here's the specific wisdom. Here's what this teaches me about God and how he sees life and how that showed up particularly in Israel. And then we think through what are other ways in my life where this same wisdom would show up today. Then we ask the question, what about ethically challenging laws, particularly women and slaves? These are the two that probably make modern people the most uncomfortable and understandably so at some level. For example, the laws describing the treatment of women or the regulation of slavery. And a lot of times you read these and you think, oh man, like slaves belonged to somebody else. That's the way they thought about it. If somebody came in as a slave and he was given a wife and he had children with that wife and then he left, he couldn't take the wife with him. You're kind of like, really? Man, that stinks. That's kind of rough. And again, there's marriage. There's laws about the treatment of women in this culture. Women were essentially viewed as, and you hear people today, progressives, they like to say that women were property. It was more that they were protected by a man. So they're protected by their father or they're protected by their husband. And there's an interesting tension and balance there at some level where the father turns it over to the daughter over to the husband. And we even do this today, right? We walk down the aisle and, who gives this woman to be wed? Her mother and I, and the father, very symbolically, but very importantly, takes the hand of that young lady and puts it on the hand of her husband. And what he's communicating is, she was under my watch, care, and guardianship. Now she's under yours. And so we like that symbolically. In the Old Testament, they took it pretty literally, and sometimes that makes us maybe a little bit uncomfortable. But there's a couple things to realize about this, and I think what's really helpful is looking at what Christ said. So turn to Matthew chapter 19. And in Matthew 19, Jesus is teaching about divorce. And he's actually asked a question about divorce. And it's important to read the question carefully because I think we miss it if we don't. let's see here. In verse 3, it says, the Pharisees came unto him, tempting him, and saying unto him, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? And really the word every cause there is the idea of any cause, any reason. Why would they ask that? Well, they ask that because there's actually a theological debate that's going on amongst the different rabbis about a text in Deuteronomy 24 that gives the reasons why you can get a divorce. And one of them is the indecency of a thing. And the grammar gets a little bit technical, but essentially there was an exegetical debate. Is that verse saying for an indecent thing? Or is that passage basically saying for an indecent or shameful incident thing, or just a thing? Anything. You could burn your dinner. Basically, we're talking about what we would call today no-fault divorce. And notice what Jesus does here. In verse 4, it says, he answered unto them and said unto them, have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? And he said, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Wherefore they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God had joined together, let not man put asunder. Now again, they're asking about a command in the law. And Jesus goes back to Genesis on them. And that throws them for a loop. And so they say in verse 7, what are you talking about? No divorce. Why did Moses then command to give a writing of divorcement and to put her away? Whoa, Jesus, you're off over your skis. Moses told us to get a divorce. What do you mean no divorce? That's what Moses said. We're debating when to get a divorce. And Jesus comes back and says to them in verse 8, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered. That means he allowed or permitted you to put away your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. Okay, so this is really important to understand about the law. The law is not God's ideal. Can you say that? Yeah, I can say that because Jesus said that. He said Moses allowed you to get a divorce. Why was divorce ever included in the law? Because God knew what was going to happen and he wanted to regulate it. And by the way, he wanted to regulate it in part to protect the women. In Hebrew culture, you couldn't just get rid of your wife and tell her to get out of your house. You had to give her a bill of divorcement. Why? Because she needed someone to take care of her, and that allowed her to go out and find a husband and get remarried. Instead of being in this awkward, oh, no, she's my wife. I thought you kicked her out. Yeah, but we're still married. No. You're going to get rid of her. You got to make it official so that she can go and marry somebody else. Jesus is saying here, the law was put as a restriction on human wickedness, but it didn't do the full job, and it wasn't designed to do the full job. The law, it was good, but it was designed to prepare the way for Christ. It was designed to take Israel where they are and move them forward. Same with the laws on slavery. We read them, and by our standards, we might look at them and say, oh, I can't believe that. But if you were an ancient person, you'd look at that and you'd think, wow, this people treat slaves with a whole lot of respect and dignity. So again, part of that is God is coming to a people and he's working with them based on where they are and based on their hardness of heart. And rather than completely upending the system and saying, no slaves, he said, no, if you're going to have slaves, here's how it has to work. And particularly with slavery, it's important to realize that this is what's called debt slavery. And this is not what happened in America. Because what happened in America was kidnapping, it was man-stealing. In many instances, you'd have these African tribes that would just go and do a raiding party and capture a bunch of people and then sell them. That was illegal in Scripture. You were not allowed to steal people. In fact, if you kidnapped somebody and sold them as a slave, it was the death penalty. What was going on in Bible times is bankruptcy. Okay? We have bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is actually a pretty sweet deal. You have more debts than you can pay until the court says, okay, you don't have to pay them. I mean, it's kind of a nice gig in some ways. Now, nobody will give you money ever again, hardly. But the point is, if you completely run out of money and you owe people, what can you do? You can sell yourself into slavery. And in Israel in particular, I think it was every 49 years it would reset, and you'd go free. And so, Jubilee, the year of Jubilee. And so it was very different from slavery as we think of it. When we think of it in America, it was racial. That was another problem. You didn't have white slaves, right? That wouldn't have even made sense. In Bible times, you had Jewish slaves. And you had nations who were there who were slaves. Like it wasn't a racial thing. It was more of a society stratus thing. And a lot of it was these people falling on hard times. They need money. They can't pay off their creditors. They sell themselves into slavery, into servitude, debt slavery, and they work for a master. And then after every year of Jubilee, they go free. That was the pattern. And God, it's kind of, you read that and you're like, oh man, this would be tough to live by. And it would require faith to live by it God's way. But he says, he's like, hey, I don't want you like counting up the number of the years to Jubilee and not helping people because of that. Like, and you could see that, right? Like Jubilee's in 2 years. Sorry, not going to help you, bud. I don't want to pay off all your debts and then get a slave for 2 years. And God says, nope, you can't do that. You got to help them. Well, that requires living by faith, because at that point you're not making a financial decision, you're making a faith-filled decision. So we could keep going with that. I think when there's ethically challenging laws, what we have to remember is this was not God's final. In fact, that's part of the reason Jesus came, was to point in that direction. And by the way, it was the teachings of Scripture that have led to the high position and the high honor and respect that are paid to women in our current culture, and that led to the abolition of slavery. Slavery was pretty much abolished first in England. They dominated the slave trade, and William Wilberforce, through grit, determination, prayer, and just hard work, outlawed the slave trade. Didn't outlaw slavery at first, he outlawed the slave trade. And the British were the biggest name on the block, so they were immediately taken out of the picture. Eventually, they outlawed slavery, and that has continued with many modern Western nations outlawing slavery. And it was Christian ideals that did that. Yes?
Somebody studied history, I guess kind of is coincidental that when they outlawed slavery, we entered into the industrial age.
Yeah.
It took us that many centuries to be illuminated, but to this point, that when the industrial age came by, where slavery was basically, John Deere freed slaves,
Yeah.
after that.
Yeah.
So it's interesting when that was abolished, God allowed us our minds to be illuminated.
Yeah.
From that standpoint.
That is an interesting, connection there, that getting rid of slavery, we were able to transition into something else. Yeah.
When the year of Jubilee, that triggered a thought, and Exodus 21:3 served for 6 years on the 7th year goes free.
Sorry, I couldn't remember if it was Jubilee or but you're right. I think the 49th year, all the land reverted back is what that was. I got that confused. Thank you, Scott, for pointing that out. So yeah, every 7 years, your slaves go free. And then every 49 years, if you've bought land, it reverts back to whoever you bought it from, which is kind of crazy. If you think about it, you buy this big portion of land to bail somebody out, and you have it for 5 years, and then it goes back to them. And it would take a lot of faith to live that way. And the faith is, if I do things God's way, even though financially it doesn't make sense, God's going to bless me. And so that's what, unfortunately, Israel didn't always live that way. In fact, part of the punishment of the exile for 70 years was to let the land lay fallow, because they were supposed to leave it and not work the land every 7 years, and they ignored that. So we know that many of these laws, they're great in theory, but people didn't have the faith to actually carry through with it, and so they missed out on those blessings. Okay, let's talk about the New Testament and the Old Covenant. Israel broke God's covenant. God came to them, he set up a covenant, and they broke it. Turn to Jeremiah 31. And we're going to look at verse 31. It says, "Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they break. They broke it, although I was an husband unto them. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my law in their inward parts, and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people." So Israel was given a covenant. They were given laws. They broke the covenant. God says, that covenant is basically defunct, but I'm going to make a new covenant with them. And in this covenant, I'm going to put my laws in their heart. When Jesus comes, he inaugurates a new covenant. In fact, he says in Luke 22:20, "This is the New Testament," or the new covenant, "in my blood." Hebrews spends a lot of time comparing the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, pointing out that both were inaugurated through blood, and then pointing out that Jesus has a far greater covenant. And so this story, remember when, I know it's been a while, but we talked about how Moses, actually we may not have talked about it, but when they cut the covenant or when they inaugurated the covenant, Moses dipped his fingers in blood and sprinkled the people. Because to start a covenant, there's a sacrifice, there's got to be blood. And so the author of Hebrews is picking up on that when he's talking about a covenant is not inaugurated without blood. And the point is, Moses used a goat as a sacrifice and sprinkled the people. Jesus gave his own life, and it is through his blood that we're now brought into the new covenant. When Jesus comes, he comes to fulfill the law and to teach his own law. Matthew chapter 5. Do not think that I am come to destroy the law. I'm not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. Now, what exactly does that mean? It would seem to have, I think, possibly two meanings and maybe both. One would be the meaning that I've not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. That Jesus himself was the fulfillment of the law. And that's true. Jesus perfectly followed the law, and in doing so became the spotless lamb that could take our sacrifice. And then the other possibility is that he means I'm bringing the law to its fulfillment or its completion. And that kind of makes sense too, especially in the context of the Sermon on the Mount, because Jesus is going to start quoting the law and then adding to it. By the way, you want proof for Jesus' divinity? He quotes the law and then adds to it. Okay? I can't do that. If I said, here's what the Bible said, but here's what I'm telling you. Okay, you'd probably get up and walk out of this class. Josh Taylor back there probably come and start beating me up. Right? Right? I can't do that. But Jesus says, it has been said to you by those of old, don't commit adultery. Who said that? Moses said that. And he said, but I say unto you, that whoever looks after a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her already in his heart. What did he just do? He just brought the law to its fulfillment, to its completion. It's not that he added to the law, really. He brought out what was already in the law. God's always been concerned about the heart. Jesus was making clear and making explicit, and that's why now we follow the law of Christ. This does not mean that the law was bad. Okay, Jesus came to fulfill the law. Believers are now thanks to the death and resurrection of Jesus, believers are no longer under the law. This does not mean that the law was bad. In fact, Paul says that it was good. Sometimes as Christians, I think we miss that. We read the Old Testament and we're reading, Exodus or Leviticus, and we're like, oh, this is bad stuff. This is the law. I can't believe. No, it was good. It was really good. The problem wasn't the law. The problem was the human heart that couldn't keep the law. And so God gave the law as a guide to direct people to Jesus and their need for him. And that's Galatians 3. Any questions on that? I thought that was going to be 5 minutes. That was a little bit longer than 5 minutes. All right, we're into the next section here in Exodus. We've talked about the redemption. God brought them out of the land of Egypt. He redeemed them. He rescued them. We then talked about the law. He brought them to Sinai, and he entered into an official contract. He signed on the dotted line. He entered the covenant with them, and now he's going to come and live with them. That was the deal. God's going to come, and he's going to dwell in your midst, and he's going to be your God, and you're going to be his people. And now he gives instructions to Moses to build him a house for the middle of the camp. And while he's giving those instructions, they break the very laws they just heard him speak directly and promise to follow. Okay? If you want a commentary on the human condition, I think you'd have a harder time finding this passage of Scripture. All that's being offered, all that's at stake, and Israel puts it all at risk by their sinful choices. So, this is one of the major themes, as I mentioned. This is kind of one of the major themes that the book takes as living in the presence of God. And that idea of before the Lord in Hebrew literally could be translated to the face of the Lord. So it has the idea of like it's right in front of somebody. I think he says in the presence of the Lord. So you're living, the idea is God's coming, he's going to live in the middle of the camp, and everything that's going on in the camp is going to be right in front of him. God's going to be your neighbor. That's the idea here. And this is all part of the plan that God has picked. If you look at the story, and you really could trace the whole Bible along this theme of God's fellowship. It begins in the garden where God is walking with Adam and Eve in the cool of the night, or in the cool of the day. And what happens? They sin and they're separated from him. And then what God is doing is he's closing the gap. So he closes the gap here with the tabernacle. then he closes the gap with the temple. And the temple's an advance on the tabernacle, namely that all the nations can now come and visit Yahweh. Right? You got this tabernacle roaming around in the desert, but when they have a temple, it's actually said, all the nations are going to flow here. And when you go anywhere else, this is what Daniel does, you pray towards Jerusalem, the holy city. That's where God is living. And then God's glory leaves the temple because of man's sin. And then what happens? Then Jesus comes. God takes on human flesh, starts walking among us. In fact, the word that's used there in John is he tabernacled. He set up his tent among us. It's translated as dwelt, but the word there has the idea of like tabernacling. And then, of course, Jesus leaves, and you're like, oh, man, God left. But then the Spirit comes, and now God is no longer just with us. He is in us. And all of this is building up into the final day where we get into the new Jerusalem, and there is no temple in the new Jerusalem because God dwells there. So as we have to realize that's the big picture, because when we get to Exodus 25 through 40, I'm going to be honest, it's a slog, right? Like if you've ever done a Through the Bible in a Year program, you're doing pretty well. You get to Exodus 21 and you start getting all these random laws. You're like, oh, okay, these are interesting, I guess. And then you hit 25, and then you get 24, and I don't remember. I've read through the Bible several times. I did not remember reading Exodus 24. I started studying it at one point. I'm like, wait, my Bible says what? And I looked at it more carefully. I'm like, how have I read through that? And it just like went over my head. But Exodus 24, if you're paying attention, is actually kind of wild. Again, they go up and they have a meal with God, and Moses is sprinkling the people, and everybody's like, we're going to follow the covenant. And then then it's like, all right, Moses, coming up, let's finish. Let's give all the details. And so he goes up there, and it is page after page after page on here's how you build a tabernacle. Right? And I'll be honest, right? I'm a preacher, I'm a pastor, man of the cloth, as they say. It is rough getting through those chapters if you're reading through the Bible. And some of the times you're reading them, I'm like, I don't even understand. Like, I'm trying to picture this in my mind. I don't even know what it's saying. Why did God spend so much time going in detail? You can see it there where it's 25 on through. And it's a lot of instructions about how to build the tabernacle. Why did God do that? Well, because he's emphasizing this theme, and the theme is God is coming to live with the people. There's something in writing that we call narrative pace. And narrative pace is the idea that the longer you talk about something, the more important it is. That when something's really important, you kind of slow down. And this is kind of easy to illustrate. If I'm telling a story and I say, so Friday morning I woke up, I went downstairs, I got out my computer, Brittany cooked some eggs, we sat down to read our Bibles. And then we read our Bibles and I came to work. And then later that day at work, you're going to be like, wait, whoa. Well, what happened in the morning? Well, nothing happened in the morning. Well, why did you tell me that? Well, I was getting to the point. Oh, is that going to be important later? No. Right, we understand intuitively, when I start giving more details, I'm giving more details because something big is coming. Right? You're building the tension. So when God takes, 16 chapters here, and most of it's devoting to the building of the tabernacle, in part, one of the things that's doing is it's explaining to us and it's letting us know, hey, something really big is coming. There's other things to note as well, and I think your textbook did a good job of working through some of those things that are there. But if nothing else, I think you walk away and realize, wow, God, you're like, why do I care about this? This is a building plan. Yeah, it's a building plan for God's house. How epic is that? God's going to build a house. You may think it's boring. If you're in ancient Israel, you should have been psyched out of your mind. God is coming to live with us. He gave us instructions. And then what happens? Well, then it is threatened. It is threatened by Israel's rebellion against God. Now, it's interesting. Turn to Exodus 32. And it's helpful to remember where we've been in the story, okay? So, just as a reminder, Israel comes to Sinai. Moses says to Israel, God wants to meet with you. Israel says, okay. God says to Moses, here are the instructions. Tell them not to come near the mountain. Make sure that they're ritually pure as much as they can be. Give some specific instructions. They come. He speaks the 10 Commandments from heaven. And they're so terrified, they go to Moses and they say, we'll do everything that the Lord says. We will agree to do it, but we can't keep hearing the voice of the Lord or we're going to die. You go and talk to the Lord for us. And God's pleased by that fear. In fact, in Deuteronomy, he says, oh, that they had such a heart in them always to fear me and to keep my commandments. Unfortunately, they don't, as we're going to see in the story. But Israel has heard the 10 commandments, right? No other gods before me. Don't make any graven images. And they've said, we will do that. Then Moses goes up onto Sinai. And 40 days later, we read that when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mount, the people gathered themselves together unto Aaron and said unto him, up, make us gods which shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we wot, or we know not what has become of him. And so Aaron makes it. It is funny because, again, Moses is the one who will write this down. And I love verse 4, because if you remember the story, Aaron's going to come to Moses and essentially say, listen, all the people gave me their gold, and I threw it into the oven, and this calf came out. Like, well, of course, what are we going to do at that point? Well, obviously, we're going to bow down and worship it. And I think Moses might have asked some more questions, because we read in verse 4, again, this is Moses writing, and he, Aaron, received them at their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool after he had made it a molten calf. Okay, so Moses is kind of like giving a little dig at his brother there, like, yeah, after he carefully fashioned and created it. And then notice what he says. And they said, these be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. And when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made proclamation and said, tomorrow is a feast to the, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. Tomorrow is a feast to Yahweh. Now there's a question here. Who is this calf supposed to represent? It seems that Aaron wants it to represent Yahweh. Right? Tomorrow's a feast to Yahweh. Let's worship Yahweh. Here he is. That's what he looks like, everybody. Because that's what everybody else did. They made a god. They made a statue. It represents your God. The god is mystically tied to it. They'd have a cleaning of the mouth ceremony where it kind of fused it to this image of it. And so Aaron's saying, tomorrow's a feast to Yahweh. Now, it's questionable whether the people see it that way, because the people never use the word Yahweh. They say, we need the gods, plural, that brought us up out of Egypt. Where are our gods? And so Aaron makes one calf and says, okay, tomorrow's a feast to Yahweh. And it's almost like he sees this thing spiraling out of control and is trying to rein it in. And he's not doing a great job, but he's like, no, this is okay. This is legit. This is on the up and up. This is still Yahweh, everybody. And it's interesting. The people, he knows what he's doing. That's a good way of putting it. In verse 6, and they rose up early on the morrow and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. And there's question about whether that play involved immoral behavior, but there seems to be, at the very least, kind of a wild, frenzied party atmosphere. Yeah.
Do you know why he specifically chose a calf, thinking historically, or?
Yeah, I think the calf was big in Egyptian mythology. In fact, you probably have seen pictures of calf gods, idols from Egypt. So we don't know necessarily exactly why, but it would make sense that probably that was a common Egyptian deity. They're also herding. They have livestock, and that seems to be one of the main, they're herders. So they're roaming around. So a calf perhaps was a symbol of strength, and it was something that they were familiar with.
Well, the Egyptians always put a head on a human body, too.
Yeah, they did, but they would also, I forget what it's called, but they have that one where there's like the sun disk, and it's in the bowl, if you've seen that. So they did, but I think there was also worship of certain animals. But you're right, they would often do these hybrids. The Greeks would do hybrids as well. What's really interesting, looking at the time, I'm sure we got time for this. What's really interesting is God told Adam and Eve that they were to rule over the animals. And one of the things that idolatry does is it inverts that, and it puts the creation, the animals, over humans. And next thing you know, you have people that are essentially worshiping animals as if they are gods. And so I think that's part of what's going on. This isn't original to me, obviously, but I do think that's part of what's going on in Romans 1 when it talks about they exchanged their glory for shame. What does that mean? It means they were created in the image of God. They were supposed to rule over the animals, and they exchanged that. And instead, what he says is they worshiped idols. They bowed down to four-footed beasts and to creatures and to creeping things. And what's interesting is, if you read that language, it echoes Genesis 1. So the very things that humans were told to rule over, they are now bowing down before. And that's part of the perversion of idolatry. And I think, again, we can recognize the smile of the serpent behind that, right? He hates the fact that humanity has been put in charge. He hates the fact that we're in the image of God, these creatures of mud. And so one of the things that he does is he tries to get us to worship what we're supposed to be ruling over. And I think it's not exactly the same, but you look at the modern culture, we don't necessarily bow down to idols, but I think some of the out-of-control environmentalism, and by the way, there's some good Christian environmentalism. We are told that we ought to watch over the creation. But there are people who act as if Christianity is a blight, or humanity is a blight on the earth. And they basically have the attitude, well, it would be good if humanity just disappeared. That would be good for the earth. And that's the opposite of what the Bible says. The Bible says that humanity is made to rule over the earth. We're a good thing for the planet. This planet was given to us, and we're supposed to take care of it. Sadly, we often don't, but that's not a reason to get rid of humanity. That's a reason to obey what God said and to carefully care for the creation he gave us. All right. So, we see God's wrath against Israel, and he basically says, I'm going to cut them off. And Moses comes and he intercedes on behalf of the people. And he says, you can't do that. Essentially, remember all the promises you made. This is interesting. Moses' intercession is based on the promises of God and the reputation of God. That's a really good pattern for us when we go in prayer. Pray from God's perspective, not from ours. And we see the same thing with Abraham. Abraham goes and he petitions Sodom and Gomorrah. And why does Abraham not want Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed? Lot's there. I mean, it's pretty transparent. In fact, later in the story, it says that God brought Lot out of Sodom because he remembered Abraham. I mean, it's pretty clear why Abraham is there petitioning for Sodom. But what does he say? It's not, hey, well, actually, I've got family living there. Can we not destroy that city? He says, wait a second. You're the judge of all the earth. You can't destroy the righteous with the wicked. A good judge wouldn't do that. What if there's 50 righteous people in the city? Would you destroy the whole city for 50 righteous? And God says, you're right. Okay, yeah, if there's 50. And then he kind of, in typical Middle Eastern fashion, he starts haggling with them. Right? And that's what they do. It's a very Middle Eastern thing. Would have made perfect sense in the culture. Abraham's haggling with God. Can we get this number down a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more? Finally gets to 10 and he thinks that he's safe. He's not, but he thinks that he is. And so, when Moses prays to God, he doesn't come and say, no, please don't do this. I really like them. He comes to them and he says, God, remember, you brought them out of Egypt. And if you brought them out of Egypt and then they all die in the wilderness, what are people going to think about you? What are they going to say? Oh, yeah, that's the God who, yeah, he can beat Egypt, but he can't even keep his people alive. What would that do to your reputation? And God, don't forget, Lord, you promised to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob that their inheritance would inherit this land. And God says, all right, you're right. Pretty incredible stuff. Moses comes down, he addresses the Israelites. He comes back and intercedes again. So the first intercession, God says, fine, I won't destroy them. The second intercession, God says, okay, you can go up in the land, but I'm not going with you. If I was among these people, I mean, it's pretty strong stuff. Look with me, if you would, at chapter 33 and verse 5. For the Lord had said unto Moses, say unto the children of Israel, ye are a stiff-necked people. I will come up into the midst of thee in a moment and consume thee. Therefore now put off thy ornaments from thee, that I may know what to do unto thee. God says, I can't deal with you. I'm not going to come up with you. I would destroy you in a moment, he says. And then I'm trying to find where it is. Let's see here. Verse 12, it says, and Moses said unto the Lord, see, thou sayest unto me, bring up this people, and thou hast not let me know whom thou wilt send with me. Yet thou hast said, I know thee by name, and thou hast also found grace in my sight. Now therefore I pray thee, if I have found grace in thy sight, show me thy way, that I may know thee, that I may find grace in thy sight, and consider this nation that this nation is thy people. And he said, my presence shall go with thee, and I will give thee rest. And he said unto him, if thy presence go not with me, carry us not up hence. For wherein shall it be known here that I and thy people have found grace in thy sight? Is it not in that thou goest with us? So shall we be separated, I and thy people, from all the people that are on the face of the earth. And the Lord said unto Moses, I will do this thing also that thou hast spoken, for thou hast found grace in my sight, and I know thee by name. So the second intercession is basically, you've got to come up with us, please. And there's a question. God's basically like, I don't know what I'm going to do with you guys. If I went up in the middle of you, if I was with you while we were going up, I'd probably wipe you all off the face of the earth. And there's almost this question, is God going to back out? And Moses comes and says, please don't. We need you. I'm not going to go up if your presence isn't with us. And God says, okay, I'll go up with you in your presence. And by the way, we read the rest of the story. God doesn't necessarily wipe all of them out immediately, but there's a lot of people that die. God wasn't wrong when he said, you are a stiff-necked people. And if I go up in your presence, a lot of people are probably going to die. And it wasn't all of them.
The whole generation died.
The whole generation dies over the 40-year period. Yeah. And part of that was wandering in the wilderness, but a lot of it was divine judgment. I mean, you read Numbers, and it's just story after story of God killed the people for this, and God killed the people for that, and God killed the people for this. And you, like, at what point are they going to realize and figure it out? And you come back and say, I don't know, at what point are we going to figure it out? Because how often do we make the same mistakes? How often do we watch people make mistakes and say, oh yeah, that was dumb, and then we turn around and we do it? And so there's this tension, right, of God's holy, righteous presence in the midst of his people. Is that a good thing? Do you want that? The answer is mostly yes, right? But there's a seriousness and a sobriety that needs to come with having God living in the middle of the camp. And so when we read 35 through 40 and they build the tabernacle, it's almost like a sigh of relief, like, whew, we made it. I can't believe it. It actually got built. They didn't ruin it. And that's really the story of the Bible. God makes incredible promises, gives blessings, just offers us the world. And we come this close to blowing it with our sin and our rebellion. And God has to come in and rescue us from our own sinful way. And I want to end, because I think this is so important, with Exodus chapter 40. And we're going to read the last 4 verses, or the last 5 verses, I guess. 34, 35, 36, 37, 30. Yeah, 5 verses of the chapter, because I think this is a fitting conclusion. It says, then a cloud covered the tent of the congregation, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle, and Moses was not able to enter into the tent of the congregation, because the cloud abode thereon, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And when the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle, the children of Israel went onward in all their journeys. But if the cloud were not taken up, then they journeyed not till that day it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was upon the tabernacle by day, and fire was on it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys. Now that raises a very important question. How do you live if God's living in the middle of the camp, and if all of this is before the Lord, before the presence of the Lord? You'd better be really careful how you live, and you'd better be really careful how close you get to him, and you'd better know where you stand with God at any moment, because if you're not careful, a lot of people, mainly you, could die. And that's why Leviticus in verse 1 says, and really, you can almost just erase the book division. Now, normally preachers like to complain about chapter divisions, and I'm one of those on occasion. But here you can almost erase the book division. The Lord comes into the tent. Not even Moses can come into the tent. He's living in the midst of the people. What are we going to do? And the Lord called unto Moses and spake unto him out of the tabernacle of the congregation, saying, speak unto the children of Israel. And now what God is going to do is he's going to explain to them, here's how you know if you can be in my presence. Here's how you know it's safe. Here's how you need to live in such a way that you're a holy people. And we'll get to that next time. There's a section there about the New Testament connections. You can look at that. Mainly, and we've talked about some of those contrasts, the Old Covenant, the New Covenant, the tabernacle in heaven, the pattern that Moses saw, and in Hebrews that's compared to the heavenly, the actual thing from which Christ came, and how now Christ is mediator of a better covenant. And then also this thing with Moses' face fading shows up in 2 Corinthians 3. Interesting stuff if you want to chase it down. We don't have time to go through all that in a survey class. So thank you for your good attention, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.